A young black researcher, Lisa Brooks, steps into the airport with excitement, ready to board her flight to a long-awaited conference. In her bag is a first-class ticket, a reward for months of relentless hard work. But as she approaches the check-in counter, something shifts. The gate agent, Sarah Jennings, barely glances at Lisa before scanning her ticket with a frown. "Sorry, this ticket isn't valid," Sarah says, her tone cold and dismissive. Lisa calmly produces the receipt, proof of her upgrade, but Sarah doesn't even look at it. "First class is full," she says, shrugging. "You'll need to go back to economy." What happened next left everyone stunned. In just minutes, Lisa's refusal to back down and the unexpected arrival of a higher-up flipped the entire situation upside down, exposing more than just a simple error. Stay with me, this story is one you'll want to hear. Before we dive in, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if this resonates, hit that subscribe button for more stories that deserve to be told. Lisa Brooks stood beneath the humming fluorescence of Terminal C, watching the steady pulse of bodies moving around her hurried. Indifferent, consumed by their itineraries, her palm rested lightly against the leather strap of her bag, the weight of it familiar yet comforting. The boarding pass tucked inside whispered of arrival, of the destination she'd earned. She had come far to stand at this gate. The early morning shadows outside stretched long over the tarmac, but inside, time felt suspended. Lisa glanced up at the digital board flashing departures. Flight 217 to Denver. First class. Scheduled. Lisa had spent the last 2 days wrapping up her presentation, a culmination of months of research on equitable housing policies. A year ago, she never imagined herself addressing a conference room full of lawmakers and academics. Now, she carried the final proof of her work, the invitation, the upgraded seat, the expectation that she would belong. But belonging is often more fragile than it appears. She adjusted the blazer draped over her arm, the soft silk lining brushing against her skin as she approached the counter. The gate agent, a woman whose blonde hair was pinned so tightly it looked like it might crack under pressure, glanced at Lisa as though she were an interruption rather than a traveler. "Good morning," Lisa offered, handing over her boarding pass. "First class. Flight 217. The agent said nothing at first. Her fingers moved over the keyboard, the clicking sharp and deliberate. Lisa waited. It was subtle, the way the woman's eyes narrowed, the hesitation in her movements as she held Lisa's pass under the scanner. Lisa had seen that hesitation before in department stores, at hotel lobbies, at dinner parties where the air grew cold just as she entered the room. The beep of the scanner finally broke the silence, but the woman's lips thinned. "There's an issue with this ticket." Lisa felt the floor settle unevenly beneath her feet. "That's strange," Lisa said, careful to keep her voice even. "I confirmed the upgrade yesterday. I have the receipt." She reached into her bag, extracting the paper like a defense attorney presenting evidence. The agent didn't take it. She simply leaned closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "Look, I don't know how this happened, but first class is full. You'll have to return to economy." A single word echoed in Lisa's mind. Return. Return to your place. Return to where you came from. Lisa had been here before. Different city, different airport, but the same unspoken rule hung in the air. Her gaze locked with the agent's, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Around them, the terminal buzzed with the sound of boarding calls and rolling luggage. Someone laughed near the coffee kiosk. But at gate C21, the air was still. "I'm not returning anywhere," Lisa said softly. "Please check again." A flicker of something amusement, condescension danced behind the woman's eyes as she crossed her arms. "I don't need to check. I know how this works." "So do I," Lisa thought. The sharp sting of disbelief settled over her like a heavy coat. But there was no scene, no raised voice. Lisa knew how fragile the line was between insistence and confrontation. Her mother had taught her that as a child, pulling her aside after the first time Lisa had been accused of shoplifting candy she hadn't touched. "Calm is your greatest weapon," her mother had whispered, smoothing Lisa's hair. "Don't give them anything to use against you." Lisa straightened, steadying her breath. She would not let them take this moment from her. "If you're unable to resolve this, I'd like to speak with a supervisor," she said, her tone polite but unyielding. The woman's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, the smile faltered. "Fine," she replied curtly, signaling to a colleague, "but it won't change anything. Lisa stepped aside, feeling the weight of unseen eyes lingering on her. Some passengers glanced her way, curiosity flickering like moths near the edges of flame. But no one spoke. This was the quiet kind of discrimination, the kind dressed in policies and professionalism. The kind that didn't shout, but whispered. The kind that left no fingerprints, only shadows. Lisa tightened her grip on the strap of her bag. She would not let the shadows win today. The supervisor arrived with the gait of a man who had been summoned one too many times before. Mark Reynolds, the small metal pin on his lapel gleaming faintly under the terminal's artificial light. Approached with a clipboard tucked tightly beneath his arm, not as a tool but as a shield. His eyes skimmed over Lisa, lingering just long enough to register something unspoken. Lisa recognized the look. It was the same glance she'd been given as a teenager when she wandered too long through high-end stores. It was the same gaze at restaurants when the waiter took just a second too long to acknowledge her. A glance that said, "What are you doing here?" Mark didn't ask for the boarding pass. He didn't need to. His posture, the slight tightening of his jaw, told Lisa that Sarah Jennings, the gate agent, had already whispered her version of events. And Lisa, in the way these things often unfolded, was not the protagonist of that story. "Is there an issue with your ticket, ma'am?" Mark asked, though his tone suggested the issue wasn't with the ticket at all. Lisa met his eyes with calm precision. "There shouldn't be. I paid for an upgrade. And I have the receipt to confirm it. The agent says otherwise." Mark nodded, but it was the kind of nod people gave when they were merely waiting for their turn to speak. "I understand," he said with a slight sigh. The type reserved for parents settling disputes between unruly children. "But unfortunately, first class is full. There's nothing we can do at this point." Lisa's heart pressed heavily against her ribs, but her voice stayed measured. "Then I'd like to know how my seat became unavailable after I confirmed the upgrade. I was told this flight wasn't overbooked." Mark shifted his weight, the clipboard sliding forward just slightly. "I'm not at liberty to discuss those details, ma'am." Lisa let his words settle in the air between them. This is how it happened, the slow erosion of dignity. The casual dismantling of certainty. She could feel the rhythm of it. The subtle escalation. The creeping edge that dared her to step out of line. She glanced over her shoulder. A small crowd of travelers. Some clutching coffee cups, others scrolling through their phones. Observed the exchange with thinly veiled interest. None would intervene, but all would remember. "I'm not asking for a favor," Lisa said quietly. "I'm asking for what I paid for. What I was promised." Mark smiled, but it wasn't the kind that offered comfort. It was the practiced smile of a man who knew how to bend just enough without breaking. "I hear you," he replied, his tone conciliatory but firm. "And I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do. We'll make sure you're comfortable in economy." Comfortable. Lisa let the word linger, tasting the bitterness of it. It wasn't comfort she was after. It was acknowledgement. She stepped aside, pulled her phone from her bag, and dialed. The familiar voice of Elizabeth Dawson, her oldest friend and now the governor of the state, answered on the second ring. "Eliza, I'm at the airport," Lisa said, turning her back slightly to the counter. "There's been an incident." There was a pause on the other end. "What happened?" Lisa kept her voice low. "I bought a first-class upgrade. They're saying it's invalid. It's not a mistake." Elizabeth's response was immediate. Clipped. "Who am I talking to?" "Supervisor Mark Reynolds," Lisa replied, eyeing him as he returned to his post near the desk. "I'll call you back," Elizabeth said before hanging up. Lisa lowered the phone, tucking it neatly back into her bag. The seconds stretched, elastic and unyielding. Mark watched her from the corner of his eye, and though he didn't speak, Lisa felt the tightening air around them. She could almost hear what he wanted to say, the quiet "why don't you just let it go?" that so many others had whispered in different ways throughout her life. But Lisa had never been good at letting things go. 15 minutes passed. The terminal continued its hum, indifferent to the battle quietly unfurling near gate C21. Then, from the far side of the terminal, Lisa saw her Elizabeth Dawson, moving with the unmistakable authority of someone who was accustomed to people getting out of her way. Her stride was deliberate, each step measured. As she approached the counter, Mark's shoulders stiffened. Sarah Jennings looked up, her face tightening in recognition. Elizabeth stopped just short of Lisa, her gaze locking onto Mark's with the precision of a surgeon about to make an incision. "I understand there's been some confusion," Elizabeth said, her voice smooth but sharp enough to draw blood. Mark cleared his throat. Governor Dawson, I wasn't aware. You are now. Elizabeth interrupted. Let's start over. Ms. Brooks has a confirmed ticket for first class. I trust that won't be an issue any longer. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but whatever defense he'd prepared crumbled beneath the weight of Elizabeth's gaze. It won't be an issue, Mark finally said, his voice brittle. Elizabeth nodded but didn't look away. Good. I'll wait here until she boards. Lisa watched as the gate agent hastily reprinted her boarding pass, the apology stumbling over itself in the agent's throat. As Lisa took the pass, she turned to Elizabeth, offering the faintest smile. Thank you, Lisa said softly. Elizabeth placed a hand lightly on Lisa's arm, her voice low but certain. You shouldn't have to fight this fight alone. Lisa exhaled, feeling the weight of the encounter settle behind her as she walked toward the jet bridge. The battle had been won, but the war, the one that stretched far beyond airport terminals, was far from over. The first-class cabin was cool. Quiet, the kind of curated quiet that costs extra. Lisa stepped inside, feeling the shift immediately, like crossing an invisible line drawn long before she'd arrived at the airport. The seats were wide, upholstered in cream-colored leather that seemed softer than anything in economy. Overhead compartments clicked shut with the gentleness reserved for the few who occupied these spaces. Lisa settled into her seat by the window. She felt the eyes before she saw them. A man in his 60s. Navy blazer pressed to perfection. Watched her from across the aisle. His gaze was not overtly hostile, but curious in that way people get when something doesn't fit. Lisa had grown used to that look, the quiet inventory taking that often led to unspoken questions. Are you supposed to be here? She unfolded the napkin on her tray table, smoothing it with slow, deliberate movements. It was a ritual, a way to claim the space around her, to remind herself that she belonged. The cabin continued to fill, but the weight of the man's eyes did not shift. Can I help you with something? Lisa asked, finally meeting his gaze. The man blinked, as if startled she had spoken aloud. He smiled tightly. No, it's not often I see younger people flying up here. Must be nice. The words were light, but the implication sank like lead. Lisa smiled back, though it didn't reach her eyes. Hard work has its benefits. The man chuckled, but there was something else beneath it, a flicker of discomfort. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his watch as though the weight of the conversation sat awkwardly on his wrist. Lisa turned her attention to the window, but the air between them stayed thick. When the flight attendant approached, the interaction was almost a mirror of the gate encounter. The attendant's polished smile faltered just slightly when her eyes met Lisa's. It was brief, a flicker of hesitation, gone in an instant, but Lisa caught it. Would you like something to drink before takeoff? The attendant asked. Pen poised over a crisp notepad. Water, please, Lisa replied. The attendant nodded, but Lisa watched the subtle delay as she moved down the aisle. Serving others first. The engines hummed, and as the plane began to taxi, Lisa thought about the 100 small ways the world signals who belongs and who doesn't. It was rarely explicit, no raised voices, no slurs hurled across rooms, but it was there, woven into the fabric of everyday life. It was in the way cashiers double-checked $100 bills, the way store employees offered help to the person beside her but not to her, the way a seat she had rightfully paid for was questioned without hesitation. As the plane lifted into the sky, Lisa exhaled slowly, pressing her forehead against the glass. She thought of her father, who had grown up under far harsher skies. In a time when the lines weren't just implied but enforced, he would often remind her, "The world will try to convince you that you are small. Don't let them shrink you." Lisa smiled faintly at the memory, but the warmth of it faded as the flight attendant returned with a glass of water, placing it on Lisa's tray table with careful precision. "Let me know if you need anything else," the attendant said, but the words felt rehearsed, hollow. Lisa nodded but didn't reply. Across the aisle, the man in the navy blazer had shifted his gaze to the newspaper spread across his lap. But Lisa could still feel the residue of his attention. For the next hour, Lisa read. The conference agenda lay open beside her, but her eyes skimmed over the words without fully absorbing them. She was halfway through an article when she heard a faint but distinct whisper coming from the seats behind her. I just don't get why she didn't take the economy seat. It's not like it matters. Lisa's body stiffened. She didn't need to turn around to know who was speaking. The voice belonged to the man in the blazer, who now leaned slightly toward his companion, as though proximity would mask the volume of his words. Maybe it was a mistake. His seatmate replied quietly. The man laughed under his breath. You saw the way she walked in. That wasn't a mistake. It's entitlement. Entitlement. Lisa let the word roll over her, heavy and sharp. She closed her book, not bothering to mark the page. Rising from her seat, Lisa turned slightly, just enough so her eyes met the man's across the narrow aisle. Is there a problem? She asked. Her voice light, measured. The man blinked, clearly unprepared for confrontation. Oh, no, he replied, too quickly. Just making conversation. Lisa nodded, holding his gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Then she settled back into her seat. But the air between them shifted, not heavier, but sharper, like glass just before it breaks. The remainder of the flight passed without incident. But even as the plane descended, Lisa knew this wasn't over. It never was. As the wheels touched down and the plane taxied to the gate, Lisa gathered her things. When she stepped into the terminal, Elizabeth was waiting for her, leaning casually against a column with the ease of someone who didn't need to prove her place in the world. Elizabeth's eyes scanned Lisa's face carefully. Rough flight? Lisa shrugged. Not the worst I've had. Elizabeth smiled knowingly. Still, she said, falling into step beside Lisa. It shouldn't have to be a battle just to sit in the seat you paid for. Lisa nodded, the words settling deep. No, she said softly. It shouldn't. The terminal felt colder than it had that morning, though Lisa suspected the chill had little to do with the air conditioning. The wheels of her suitcase whispered softly against the polished floor, the sound barely audible beneath the murmur of travelers weaving around her. Elizabeth walked beside her, silent for the moment. There was a knowing between them, the kind forged not from words but from the quiet exchanges black women share when the world insists on making them small. It was Elizabeth who broke the silence first. Tell me, she said, casting Lisa a sideways glance. Did you let him sit comfortably the rest of the flight? Lisa smiled faintly. No, she replied, but I don't think he understood why. Elizabeth laughed under her breath, but the warmth in it was short-lived. They reached the escalator, descending into the lower terminal where crowds thickened around the baggage claim. Lisa felt the shift immediately, the slow recalibration of space as eyes lingered longer than they should have. It wasn't blatant, it rarely was, but it was there, the slight stiffening of the older couple to her left as she passed by. The narrowing gaze of the man in the business suit at Carousel 3. The subtle but unmistakable shrinking of personal space as though proximity alone might invite discomfort. Lisa had lived with this long enough to know that racism was rarely the loud, snarling thing it had been in her father's time. More often, it was polite, dressed in soft tones and careful language. It didn't announce itself with slurs, it whispered behind closed doors, smiled through clenched teeth, and moved quietly, just out of reach. As the carousel hummed to life, Lisa stepped forward, planting herself in clear view, unbothered, unshrinking. Elizabeth stood just behind her, arms crossed, as if daring anyone to say what they were already thinking. Lisa's suitcase appeared a few rotations later, and she lifted it easily, tugging it beside her as they made their way toward the exit. They were nearly to the terminal doors when a voice, clipped and efficient, called from behind them. Ma'am? Lisa turned, finding herself face to face with a TSA agent, middle-aged, pale, the badge on his chest glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights. Is there a problem? She asked, noting the way his gaze lingered a little too long on her suitcase, as if he were willing it to reveal something incriminating. Random bag check, he said, though the words felt rehearsed. Won't take but a moment. Lisa's grip tightened around the handle. Elizabeth stepped closer, her voice calm but edged in steel. I didn't realize random looked so predictable, she said. The agent's expression didn't change. Just doing my job. Lisa could feel the eyes again, not just from the agent, but from the crowd behind them. This was the kind of moment that people pretended not to see but would later recount over dinner tables in hushed tones. She thought about refusing. She thought about the articles, the video clips, the long list of names that began with inconvenience and ended with something far worse. Instead, Lisa smiled. Of course, she said, her voice like glass, smooth but sharp at the edges. The agent led them to a side table, setting her suitcase down as two more TSA officers loitered nearby, pretending to be preoccupied but clearly paying attention. Lisa flicked the lock open with a quiet snap. The agent sifted through her belongings with the same disinterest one might give to flipping channels on late-night television. A neatly folded blazer, 2 books, a laptop. He lingered on the books Toni Morrison's beloved stacked atop James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. His fingers hovered there for just a second too long. He glanced at Lisa, but she said nothing. Finally, he zipped the suitcase shut, stepping back with a nod. "You're all set," he said. Lisa closed the suitcase, pulling the handle upright. She met his gaze head-on. "Thank you," she said, but the words weren't gratitude. Elizabeth watched him for a moment longer, her eyes narrowing just slightly before she and Lisa turned toward the exit. The glass doors slid open with a soft hush, and the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the pavement outside. Elizabeth waited until they reached the curb, the weight of the terminal pressing against their backs, before speaking. "Was that necessary?" Lisa shrugged. "Necessary for him or necessary for me?" Elizabeth shook her head, adjusting the strap of her purse. "I'll say this much," she said. "Your patience is thicker than mine." Lisa smiled faintly. "I've had practice." The car pulled to the curb, and as the driver stepped out to open the trunk, Lisa caught sight of their reflection in the glass window beside them. 2 black women standing side by side, resilient but weary reflections of generations that had come before, and of those who would follow. Elizabeth met her eyes in the glass. "You ever wonder," she said quietly, "how long we'll have to keep proving we belong?" Lisa didn't hesitate. "Every day," she replied, "but I stopped asking permission a long time ago." Elizabeth nodded, her lips curving into something between pride and exhaustion. "Good," she said, stepping into the car. Lisa followed, and as the car merged into traffic, the weight of the day slipped quietly into the rearview mirror but not far enough to disappear. It never was. The hotel lobby was a portrait of quiet wealth, marble floors polished to the shine of still water, gold trim along the edges of towering columns, and the low murmur of conversations held in delicate restraint. Lisa walked in with Elizabeth at her side, their heels striking sharp, deliberate notes against the smooth floor. Lisa knew this kind of place. She'd grown up knowing it from the outside, watching her father slip off his hat as they passed lobbies like these in cities they visited. "A man should walk with respect," he used to say, his voice low and steady. "But don't ever forget, they expect you to walk small." Lisa was grown now. She didn't walk small. The concierge desk stretched across the far side of the room, where 2 young men in crisp suits murmured into headsets, barely glancing at the guests who passed by. Behind them stood an older man, silver hair, perfect posture, whose eyes drifted over Lisa as she approached. His gaze was brief, polite, but polite could be a mask. "Good evening," Lisa said, offering a small nod. "I have a reservation." "Lisa Brooks." The man's smile was thin, professional. His fingers danced across the keyboard. Elizabeth lingered a few steps behind, scanning the room with a sharp gaze that seemed to weigh each person in turn. The man behind the counter frowned slightly. "I'm not seeing a reservation under that name," he said, glancing up. Lisa's fingers tightened against the handle of her suitcase. "There must be a mistake," she replied, calmly. "It was booked 3 days ago. Through the conference coordinator. You can check under the block for keynote speakers." The man's expression didn't change. "I've checked the system," he said. "I'm afraid I don't see your name listed." Lisa exhaled slowly, feeling the soft pull of déjà vu. Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice cool. "Her reservation should have been confirmed this morning," she said, her tone edged in the quiet authority that accompanied her title. "Perhaps you'd like to check again." The man hesitated, his eyes flickering to Elizabeth, registering the shift. The weight of the governor's presence altered things. Lisa saw it happen, the way his posture straightened just slightly. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Let me double-check." But Lisa already knew the outcome. This was not a mistake of the system. It was the kind of mistake that often had no record, no paper trail. It was the error of assumption, the kind that placed black women on the other side of velvet ropes. "Asking to be let in." "I'll wait," Lisa said quietly. She stepped back, giving him space to run the same search she knew would yield nothing new. Elizabeth folded her arms across her chest. watching with the faint smirk of someone who had fought this battle too many times to count. A few minutes passed. The man's frown deepened. "It appears we're fully booked tonight," he said finally. "There may have been a miscommunication with the conference organizers. I'd be happy to recommend a nearby hotel." Lisa raised a hand, cutting him off with a polite but firm gesture. "That won't be necessary," she said. "I'd like to speak to your manager." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, but he masked it quickly. "Ma'am, I assure you." "Manager," Lisa repeated, her voice a touch sharper now. The man hesitated, but after a brief glance at Elizabeth, he relented. "One moment." As he disappeared into a back office, Lisa leaned against the counter, exhaling quietly. Elizabeth chuckled softly. "You know," she said, lowering her voice, "there was a time when I might have let this slide." Lisa arched a brow. "And now?" Elizabeth's gaze darkened slightly. "Now I make sure people remember my name." Lisa smiled. "I prefer that approach." A few minutes later, the manager emerged, a tall black woman in a tailored suit, who moved with the fluid confidence of someone who knew exactly where she stood in the world. Her name tag read Marion Davis. She approached with purpose, offering Lisa a nod of acknowledgement before turning to the concierge with a cool glance that seemed to unearth every silent bias he thought he'd hidden. "Ms. Brooks," she said, her voice warm, "I apologize for the inconvenience. I'm not sure how this oversight happened, but I'll make sure you're settled right away." Lisa held her gaze for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Thank you, Ms. Davis." Marion's eyes softened just slightly. "Please," she said, gesturing toward the elevator, "allow me to escort you personally." Elizabeth caught Lisa's eye as they followed Marion toward the elevators, the unspoken weight of the moment trailing behind them. As the elevator doors slid shut, Marion turned to Lisa. "If you need anything during your stay," she said, lowering her voice, "don't hesitate to call me directly." Lisa nodded. "I appreciate that." Marion hesitated for just a breath longer, something unsaid flickering in her eyes. "Sometimes," she added quietly, "you have to remind them who you are." Lisa met her gaze, the truth of it settling between them like an old, familiar refrain. "I always do," Lisa replied softly. The elevator chimed, the doors opening to the suite level. As Lisa stepped into the hallway, she felt Elizabeth's hand press briefly against her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity, of understanding. "Funny thing about places like this," Elizabeth mused as they walked. "They build these walls to make you feel small, but the moment you stop shrinking, they don't quite know what to do with you." Lisa smiled, feeling the weight of the day begin to ease, if only slightly. "Well," she said, glancing toward her suite door, "they'll figure it out soon enough." The suite was quiet, but not peaceful. It held the kind of silence that hums beneath the surface, the silence of spaces that were not designed for you but tolerated your presence nonetheless. Lisa stood by the window, watching the soft glow of the city below. The skyline stretched wide, lit by promises it rarely kept. Her phone buzzed. Elizabeth's voice drifted through the receiver. "Dinner's at 7. The mayor's hosting." Lisa sighed. "What's the occasion?" Elizabeth chuckled, but it carried no humor. "Fundraising, I'm sure. But there'll be cameras. Best to remind people you exist." Lisa glanced at her reflection in the window's sharp cheekbones, eyes that did not waver. "I wasn't planning on being a spectacle tonight." "You don't have to plan for it," Elizabeth replied. "It comes either way." By the time Lisa stepped into the restaurant's private dining room, the atmosphere had thickened, not with smoke or perfume, but with the weight of familiarity. Conversations layered over one another like silk curtains, soft but impenetrable. The room was filled with people who had learned the art of occupying space without invitation. Elizabeth was already seated near the far end of the table, speaking to the mayor's wife with the ease of someone who had long since stopped caring if her presence unsettled others. Lisa moved carefully, weaving between chairs and the slow turn of heads. She could feel the shift, subtle but present. It wasn't hostility, it was curiosity, wrapped in velvet gloves. "Lisa Brooks," someone greeted her, hand outstretched, smile polished. The man was tall, trim, his silver hair swept back in the careful way of men who had long ago traded sweat for influence. "I've been reading about your work." "Impressive." Lisa shook his hand, the grip firm but brief. "Thank you," she replied, her smile polite but thin. He gestured to the seat beside him, where no one else had dared sit. "Please, join us." She settled into the chair, her back straight. It didn't take long for the questions to come. First, they were soft inquiries about her research, polite nods to the conference. But soon, the questions sharpened, cutting closer to the bone. So, the man began, swirling the dark amber liquid in his glass. What led you to focus so heavily on race and housing policy? Lisa glanced at Elizabeth, who met her gaze without offering rescue. This was part of the process. I suppose I focus on it, Lisa said slowly, because I've never had the luxury of ignoring it. The man chuckled, though his eyes held no laughter. Fair point, but don't you think sometimes these issues get overstated? Lisa placed her fork down carefully, letting the weight of his question settle between them. Overstated, she echoed, tilting her head slightly. I imagine it depends on where you're sitting. His smile flickered, just for a second. He hadn't expected her to push back. Not here. Not at this table, where politeness often served as currency. I only meant, he continued, that things are better than they used to be. Progress takes time, doesn't it? Lisa felt the eyes of the room shift subtly toward her, waiting for her reply. Time doesn't create progress, she said softly, but firmly. People do, and often, the ones who push for it pay a heavier price than those who simply wait for the benefits. Elizabeth hid her smirk behind her glass. The man's smile faded further, but he nodded, as if conceding a silent round. Lisa didn't need him to agree. Agreement wasn't the point. She wasn't here to convince anyone. She was here to remind them. Later, as the evening stretched thin and the room began to empty, Elizabeth joined Lisa near the coat check. You made him uncomfortable, Elizabeth said, pulling on her coat. Lisa shrugged. Good. Elizabeth's laugh was genuine this time. You know, there was a time I thought silence was the safer option. Lisa's eyes narrowed. And now? Elizabeth looped her scarf, adjusting it carefully. Now I realize silence is just permission dressed in softer clothes. Lisa smiled faintly. As they stepped into the cool night air, Lisa felt the weight of the evening lift slightly. But not entirely. The road ahead stretched long, with no shortcuts, no exits. But she had never been one to take the easy path. The morning sunlight spilled through the tall glass windows of the conference center, cutting long shadows across the polished floor. Lisa Brooks walked with purpose, heels striking in sharp rhythm, the echo carrying down the corridor like the tick of a clock winding toward confrontation. Elizabeth had left early, caught in a web of press meetings and policy sessions. Lisa, however, had one final meeting before her keynote address, a closed-door roundtable with the city's largest housing developers. She knew what awaited her there. The boardroom was already full when Lisa entered. Men in dark suits, women in muted tones, their posture rigid and practiced. This was a space of power, but it was not hers. Not yet. Ms. Brooks. A voice greeted her from the far end of the long mahogany table. Richard Davenport, CEO of one of the most prominent real estate firms in the state, rose just slightly from his chair, his smile carefully curated to appear warm, but not too warm. Please, take a seat. Lisa nodded, sliding into the empty chair across from him. The weight of their gazes was immediate. She unpacked her notebook slowly, each movement deliberate. Thank you all for having me, she said, folding her hands lightly over the cover. I understand we're here to discuss equitable housing initiatives and how new policy recommendations might impact future developments. Davenport leaned back, fingers steepled under his chin. We're looking forward to hearing your insights, he replied smoothly, though I suspect we may not see eye to eye on everything. A murmur of polite laughter trickled down the table, but Lisa caught the undertone. We don't expect you to win here. Difference in perspective is necessary for progress, she said evenly. Davenport's eyes narrowed, but he smiled. The conversation began civilly. Numbers, projections, the language of compromise. They listened, nodding at appropriate intervals, but Lisa could feel the weight of their resistance pressing against every word she spoke. It wasn't overt. It rarely was. Instead, it lived in the way they shifted in their chairs, the way their questions danced around uncomfortable truths without ever addressing them directly. Well, Davenport said after she outlined a proposal for increasing affordable housing within high-income districts. I think we can all agree on the principle. The challenge lies in execution. There are market realities we have to consider. Market realities. Lisa's fingers curled slightly around the edge of her notebook. I appreciate that, she replied, her tone soft but edged. But these realities you mentioned tend to fall hardest on those with the least to lose. Affordability can't be treated as an afterthought. A woman 2 seats down cleared her throat. We understand the need for inclusive growth, Ms. Brooks, but if we create too many barriers for developers, we risk slowing investment altogether. Lisa met her gaze. Perhaps, she said, but if equity is viewed as a barrier, then the real question is, who is this city being built for? Silence unfolded across the room like a thin sheet of ice. Davenport's smile faded at the edges. It's not that simple, he said finally. Lisa leaned forward slightly, letting the weight of her next words settle in. It never is, she said, but simple doesn't mean right. And complexity isn't an excuse for inaction. A faint tension crackled beneath the surface. Subtle but undeniable. Lisa watched as Davenport exchanged glances with a few of the others. The kind of silent communication that spoke louder than words. This was the moment when many backed down, softened their tone, reshaped their message to fit the mold that was expected of them. But Lisa did not come to fit molds. She let the silence linger, watching the discomfort stretch, refusing to fill the space they left open. Davenport was the first to speak, clearing his throat as though brushing aside invisible dust. Your points are well taken, he said carefully, the diplomatic answer of a man who wasn't ready to concede but knew better than to dismiss. I think we have a lot to consider moving forward. Lisa smiled faintly. I hope so. As the meeting concluded, hands were shaken, cards exchanged, but Lisa knew the work wasn't finished. It rarely was. As she stepped into the hallway, Elizabeth was waiting, leaning casually against the wall, arms crossed. How did it go? Elizabeth asked, though the glint in her eye suggested she already knew. Lisa exhaled, allowing herself a small smirk. I didn't let them get comfortable. Elizabeth laughed, falling into step beside her. You never do, she replied, and that's exactly why they need you at the table. Lisa glanced down the corridor, watching the boardroom doors slowly swing shut behind them. I don't just want to be at the table, Lisa said softly. I want to change what's being served. Elizabeth's eyes darkened with something like pride. And you will, she said, whether they like it or not. The stage lights burned softly, not bright enough to blind, but enough to sharpen the edges of the room. Rows of faces stretched before Lisa, lawmakers, executives, community leaders, all perched in quiet anticipation. Lisa stood at the podium, her fingers resting lightly against the cool wood. From this vantage point, the room looked vast, yet she could feel the weight of every gaze. She had spoken in rooms like this before. The architecture of power had a certain symmetry, the way the chairs arranged themselves in obedient rows. The way the voices hushed, not out of respect, but expectation. She knew the ritual. They had invited her here, not because they wanted to hear uncomfortable truths, but because they wanted the appearance of listening. The invitation itself was a kind of transaction, a performance. But Lisa had long since stopped performing for their comfort. She glanced briefly at Elizabeth, seated in the front row. Her friend's eyes, sharp and unyielding, met hers. It was not reassurance Lisa found there, but a reminder. The room quieted further as Lisa leaned into the microphone. Good afternoon, she began, her voice steady, each syllable deliberate. I was asked to speak today about equitable housing, about policy, about development. She paused, letting her words ripple across the room, soft but persistent. But that's not really why I'm here. The quiet shifted, subtle, but present. I stand here because this conversation isn't new. Lisa continued. It's been happening for generations. In different rooms, under different names. The policies change, the language changes, but the core of the issue remains the same. This is not just about buildings and budgets. It's about belonging. A few heads nodded slowly. But Lisa could see the hesitation flicker across others, the resistance. Faint but telling. She let the silence hang. I've spent my career listening, Lisa said, her voice tightening with something heavier now. Listening to the families displaced by rising rents. Listening to the young mothers who walk past luxury apartments they will never afford. Listening to the quiet sighs of elders who have lived in neighborhoods long enough to see them reshaped into places where they no longer feel welcome. Lisa shifted her gaze, scanning the room with careful precision. You see, she continued, when people say things are better than they used to be, what they really mean is that the discomfort is quieter. It doesn't shout from across the street anymore. It whispers from behind closed doors. Through zoning laws. Through subtle shifts in policy that favor profit over people. Elizabeth crossed her legs, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. She had heard this tone before, the edge that crept into Lisa's voice when she had grown tired of pretending the system was broken, rather than working exactly as designed. Lisa glanced down at her notes, though she didn't need them. I often think about my father, Lisa said softly. He used to tell me that the most dangerous thing about injustice is not that it exists, but that it becomes normal. It becomes part of the scenery, something you walk past every day until you stop seeing it altogether. The room shifted again, the weight of those words settling in deep. We sit here, Lisa continued, in this beautiful room, discussing equity as if it's a favor, as if it's something we bestow upon those who ask politely. But equity is not charity. It's not a gift, it's a right. And until we begin to build our cities, our policies, and our communities around that truth, we will continue to have these same conversations in rooms just like this. Lisa let her words settle, watching them echo in the faces before her. She could see it now, the slow unraveling of polite smiles, the quiet shifting of postures. Some were leaning in, others leaning away, but no one looked indifferent. And that was the point. As Lisa prepared to close, she caught Elizabeth's gaze once more. Progress, Lisa said, her voice dropping slightly, is not measured by the comfort of those in power. It's measured by the ability of those without it to finally exhale. Silence fell. Lisa stepped back from the podium. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the applause began, hesitant at first, but growing in strength. Elizabeth rose to her feet, and a ripple followed as others stood with her. Lisa didn't smile. Not yet. This was only the beginning. As she stepped off the stage, Elizabeth was waiting. You didn't hold back, Elizabeth said, her eyes gleaming. I wasn't invited to, Lisa replied. Elizabeth laughed softly, looping her arm through Lisa's as they walked toward the exit. You know, Elizabeth said, lowering her voice, there are easier ways to make a living. Lisa glanced sideways, a faint smirk playing at her lips. But none is necessary, she replied. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the street. Lisa paused for a moment, staring at the city skyline. The fight ahead was long. But that was the thing about change, it didn't happen all at once. It happened in increments, in conversations, in small fractures that eventually split wide enough for light to break through. And Lisa? She was here to hold the door open,